Welcome to the Let Me Save You 25-Year podcast, where we break down a new Shawnism each week. Each one is a lesson I've learned along the way in hopes that you can maybe learn from my mistakes and build great things even bigger, better, and faster than I ever did. Perhaps shaving off a decade or two of your own. My book, called Let Me Save You 25 Years, where today's topic comes from, launches very soon. So stay tuned. I'm your host, Shawn D, Nelson, and founder and CEO of Lovesac, and I'll have Dan Pink on with me later today, author extraordinaire. Today's topic that I'm going to break down with Dan is push yourself out of the nest. Critical concept for any entrepreneur, business person, really anyone who wants to do anything remotely great. You know, don't have to be an entrepreneur. It can be an employee, it can be a team member. Can be not even in a professional setting, a parent, a brother, a sister, a companion, whatever. You know, a bias for action beyond just doing something, but really pushing yourself out of the nest, out of your comfort zone. In my case, in the book, I share this chapter called The Mill, where I had to fly to China to find this fabric that I had seen at this trade show because the client wanted 30,000 yards of this fabric for our first big 12,000 sack order. And I didn't speak Chinese to him because I was fluent in Chinese at the time, having lived there a few years, long story. But I didn't speak Chinese. I wanted to hold my cards. And as it turned out, they'd start speaking Chinese in front of me about how much it cost to manufacture this fabric. This is right at the fabric mill that made this fabric. And I could understand what their salespeople were saying to each other and the manufacturers about this fabric, how much it costs, et cetera. So I knew that they could afford to hit my price point. So I just sat there and negotiated for 3 days in English, because they'd speak a little English, you know, they're salespeople. Over there in China, you know, it's $5, then $4, and $3. And okay, we'll do the deal. This is them speaking. We'll make no money, but we want to get you as a client. And I knew they were telling the truth because I could hear how much it cost them to manufacture this fabric. And so I had this edge. But then they asked me right away, we need a $65,000 deposit to make this big order for you. I'm a waiter at the time. I'm literally waiting tables, paying my way through college. I'm finishing up my last semester of school. I've taken this big order because it sort of found me. I have no business, and I'm about to give up again. I've almost given it up many times. And here I am, like, I don't have $65,000. I don't have $5,000, but I call up the client. I say, hey, I'm over here at my factory. I'm ready to go with your order. I just need a $65,000 deposit to get started. They say, no, you know, we're this big national retail chain. We don't give deposits. We're better than that. You're this tiny manufacturer. I said, what are you talking about? We're Lovesac. We've never done a deal without a deposit. Be what you will, be not what you are. But I really had to convince them to send me this money, and they wired me. They ended up wiring me $65,000 to my University of Utah credit union account, because it's the only bank account I had. I wired that money to China, and now I had spent $65,000 of their money. I was committed. I was on the hook. And that moment, I don't think I realized it at the time. I was just kind of doing the next thing as I'm preaching, as I always preach. But when I sent that wire, I now had to finish this order. I mean, it would end up in lawsuits. I've spent their money. I was committed. And I talk about the idea of embracing economic pressure. You know, as controversial as that is, there's no force more powerful, honestly, than the crushing weight of debt. And I'm not telling you to go take on debt necessarily. I'm just saying sometimes we shy away from the economic pressure. We shy away from risk. But when you put yourself in a position where you have to fly, you have pushed yourself out of the nest and you have to fly, you will be shocked how often you learn to fly real fast. And that's exactly what we did. I flew back home. I credit carded my way to an entire sack factory, and we built it, and we completed this order a few months later. And it was a really eye-opening experience for me. It wasn't the first time that I had pushed myself out of the nest, but it was the biggest time, and it felt like the most audacious and scary. But almost anything we want to do that's worth doing will require total commitment at some point. Intuitively, it's up to you to recognize when is that time to fully commit. In my case, by the way, I was waiting tables until the day we started stuffing sacks for that big order. I'm not kidding. I was waiting tables, wrapping up school, and then in the evenings, I would go down to our factory we had leased, we were building for that big order, sweep up the floors, start building wood tables to manufacture on. I was building the factory while I was still a waiter. And I waited tables up till the day that I finally had to quit because I was going to be working in that factory from 6 a.m. until deep into the night, trying to complete this 12,000 sack order. So, we don't always push ourselves out of the nest in one shot. You might keep one toe going for revenue, for income, but there comes a point where we all have to quit that day job. And for me, it was that moment. And look, I don't have a perfect answer for you. It takes your intuition. I would say generally hang on to it as long as you possibly can, but don't be afraid when it finally comes time. I mean, you're going to feel fear, but just, I love what Dan's going to share with us about some of his research on regret, making decisions, having a bias for action. These are all things that, I've been championing in the book, my book, as well as in life for a long time. You'll never be totally sure. You'll never have perfect information. It will feel scary, and you just have to go for it. Listen, one of the last things I talk about in this short chapter in the book is that nobody really cares anyway. Nobody really cares anyway. I mean, we put our successes out on social media. We try and put on a good face. We try and, look slick. In the end, no one's even paying attention. They're scrolling past and then they see a funny cat video. No one's even paying attention. No one really. So, I think in our heads, sometimes we try to defend ourselves, and we're so afraid of failure. We're so afraid of looking bad, when in reality, most people don't even notice. As you know, I had to start Lovesac completely over in an embarrassing reorganization, full bankruptcy after winning $1 million on TV. The truth is, most people out in the world, they had no idea. They stumbled into our store the next day, the next week, the next month, the next year. They had no idea Lovesac went through that. They were buying couches from us just the same. Some people did. A few people did. But that was a very public, embarrassing situation, the worst kind of failure. And in reality, and even those that did, so what? They were still in there buying couches from us, at least considering it. Nobody cares. You think everyone cares. Get over it. One last concept before we get with Dan. Another way I could have titled this chapter, something I believe in, is this idea of just booking the gig. So I came up a musician. That was my other side hustle. Besides waiting tables, I played weddings. I'm a piano player. I'm a singer. I eventually got into jazz trios, and then I eventually became a party band, cover band, played bars, nightclubs. I did this for 15 years of my life. Made money, made great money, hundreds of dollars an hour being a musician. It was way more fun than waiting tables or even stuffing sacks. I miss it today. In fact, there's a side of me I might, if I could do nothing else, I'd just go back to playing bars and nightclubs. It's so much fun. But I used to book, when I was 15, 16 years old, I used to book weddings because my uncles did this. I saw them making money this way. I knew how to play the piano. I booked my first wedding before I had any repertoire. I had to play for 3 hours. This is just background piano music, but it's somebody's wedding. If I mess this up, I'm going to wreck the ambiance. It'll be an embarrassment. But I booked the gig, and I had about, a month or two to put together 3 hours worth of piano music. Since that time at 15 years old, I've been booking gig after gig after gig. I've booked, $10,000, $20,000 gigs for my band where we didn't have even a full band. We didn't, we were lacking a certain player. We were lacking the repertoire to fill out whatever it was that they were looking for their giant corporate party or event or whatever. But I booked the gig, And then we'd spend the next month just, we pushed ourselves out of the nest. We had to fly. I really believe in the power of booking the gig, embracing economic pressure, pushing yourself out of the nest. It's all the same thing, really. And I'm about to break it down with one of my favorite authors of all time, Mr. Dan Pink. Here we go. With me today is an actual author, nay, a celebrated author, and one of my favorite authors of all time. I'm not joking. This is unprovoked, unbiased. I began reading his books nearly 15 years ago. He has published at least 7 of them properly, along with countless articles and essays. 5 of his books are actual New York Times bestsellers, even #1 bestsellers, which is no small feat, trust me. He's a father of 3. Dan lives in DC, where he continues to churn out amazing literature, usually based on serious scientific studies, but made accessible by his straightforward and provocative writing style. He has first taught me how to think critically about motivation and compensation when I read Drive, as I built my own company and team of talent. I loved his book, When, and I'm just about to base my entire sales training for my entire company here in a few weeks on his book, To Sell is Human. He went on to vindicate creative lunatics like me in A Whole New Mind, and then again vindicated my self-loathing and penchant for retrospect and rumination in his instant bestseller just last year, The Power of Regret. Who better to speak with about pushing oneself out of the nest than someone who has clearly done exactly that himself over and over and over again in his career, Mr. Daniel Pink.
Thank you for that rousing introduction. I appreciate it, Shawn. And I'm hoping that in the course of this conversation, you're going to save me 25 years.
Let's do it. We'll maybe not 25, but maybe, we'll see if we can
25 minutes.
25 minutes. We can cut it short. I can at least give that back to you. No, hopefully not. Look, Dan, I really excited. You're a wise soul. You know this, but so this week's Shawnism, we call it number 7 on the list of these first 25 that are named in the book, comes out this winter. Let me save you 25 years. One that I have been preaching since 2002, when I coined this idea, at least, didn't trademark it, didn't write a book on it, but my phone rings one day. Okay, Dan, I'll set this up while I'm stuffing a sack as a side hustle. And, we've got this big order, 12,000 sacks, big blue fuzzy fabric, Shanghai. Went to source this thing, spoke English, and I had to walk away from like a proper job that was waiting for me to pursue this, what had been a 3-year side hustle in college. I had this high-paying career on the left hand. On this other hand, I had this unknown rabbit hole that was going to cost me $250,000 to produce, build a factory on credit cards, etc. And I had to make that leap. I had to just push myself out of the nest, go for it. So you've got all kinds of stuff you've written on regret, stuff we didn't do, all the things, Dan. What do you think of when you hear this idea of push yourself out of the nest?
I generally think it's a good thing, and for a whole host of reasons. And I'll add a caveat to it, though. One of the things that I've seen, and let's go back to, I can talk about my own experience on this, and that's somewhat instructive. But I think what's more instructive is some of the research that I've done on this topic of regret that you mentioned earlier, where we've now collected regrets from over 25,000 people all over the world, 25,000 regrets from people in 109 countries, and 110 countries. And one thing that comes out very clearly is that what people regret more are what they didn't do than what they did do. Overwhelmingly, people regret inactions way more than actions. And so I think that tells us something. And I think what it tells us is that at some level, we should have in our lives a bias for action, for doing stuff. And that's largely because our assessment of risk is often, not always, but often overstated. And one way is as long as you sort of have a realistic sense of the risk, I think it is worth edging oneself out of the nest if the risk isn't massive. Because what I've seen over and over again is when people do not do that, they regret it. Now, in my database of 25,000 regrets, there are people who took action, who took a risk, and it went south on them. And some of them regret it, but they are overwhelmed by a factor of 50, probably 60 of people who didn't take the risk and wish they did.
Wow, that's powerful. It's funny you mentioned the bias for action. That's actually a phrase straight out of chapter 1 of my little short book. That first chapter called "Just Do Something."
Yeah.
And so many people talk about going to exotic lands. You're going to do it. So many people talk about a lot of things. So many people talk about the book they want to write. And look, having now not even written one, being in the process right now of writing this one, I have so much respect for people like you who don't just do it, but are able to do it over and over, because it is a hard, grueling, long process and especially the way you go at it. I mean, I'm just writing stuff, right out of my own brain. You actually engage in this research that extends over years. Like, I can't imagine it. So how do you, let's go back to the beginning. Like, was there a push yourself out of the nest moment for you, where it's like you had to take some action from which you couldn't, and that's the metaphor, right? You couldn't,
Mm-hmm.
You had to flap your wings or you were going to splat on the ground. Like, does anything come to mind?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Again, I'm going to come at that with a caveat, though.
Sure.
So I'll give, because I think that what's important here is not just in terms of deriving lessons from these, is not simply pushing yourself out of the nest for the sake of pushing yourself out of the nest, not pushing yourself out of the nest in a thoughtless way, not pushing yourself out of the nest if you actually don't know how to fly at all, and there is a concrete floor 10 stories below you. All right. So there's calculation here as well. But my argument here, Shawn, is that we often miscalculate. And I think that's the most important thing. So here's what happened. Here's what happened with me. I was working as a political speechwriter for a while. I realized, having been keenly interested in politics for much of my early life, then working in politics and having some pretty interesting jobs there, and kind of more or less enjoying the jobs, realizing that this is not what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And what I wanted to do with the rest of my life was actually be a writer of my own. It took me a while to get there, but that's what I decided I wanted to do. So how does one do that? Here I pushed myself out of the nest, but I did it in a calculated way. So I quit my job and I said, I'm going to go to the third floor of our house in Washington, D.C. and try to make it as a writer. But my wife did not quit her job. My wife did not get rid of her health insurance. So I pushed myself out of the nest, but I did it in a calculated, intelligent way. And I think that, to me, that is in some ways the most important lesson. And again, we always have to try stuff, and trying stuff is daunting. Trying stuff is risky. Trying stuff is scary. But a way to think about this is, I'll give you two ways to think about it. When you don't try stuff, you're making a choice. So think about what are the opportunity costs of not pushing yourself out of the nest. And then also think about what's the worst thing that can happen if you push yourself out of the nest. And in many cases, and for many people, not everybody, but for many people, that nest is positioned not at the top of a sequoia, but at the top of a relatively modest tree. So even if you fall out of the nest and clunk to the ground, you're going to have some bruises, but you're going to be fine.
Yeah, I love that. Actually, in this actual little chapter, and by the way, my book is extremely short. You can read the whole thing like 60 minutes. I wrote it short on purpose, which is crazy for me because, if you were to get to know me, I have plenty to say. But in this crazy short chapter, I actually talk about that exact thing, that if people were to actually contemplate their truly worst case scenario,
yeah,
it usually doesn't involve their skull cracking open on concrete, right?
Absolutely.
Like, it usually involves, like, I even mention it, like, maybe you end up with your in-laws again in the basement somewhere, couch surfing. And I'm not saying that's a good outcome. I'm just saying, for much of, the kind of people that might listen to this podcast, and I had to face that a few times, like, what is my actual worst case scenario? And even the worst kind of things, like, I had to take Lovesac through a complete Chapter 11 bankruptcy reorganization, which was humiliating. That's after winning $1 million on TV with Richard Branson. Humiliating event. As it turns out, I still got all my limbs, still got all my kids. But
Yep.
there's worse things. So I think the miscalculation is a really fantastic thing to explore. Did you ever come across this book, Factfulness, Dan? Has that ever
I
come
know
up?
the book. Yeah. I haven't read it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of a fun one. He talks a lot about that exact thing, how humans are terrible actually at calculating and estimating.
Terrible.
And, we get it wrong, both to the good and to the bad, like all over the place. And he gives countless examples, but that's one of my favorites as well. But yeah, I love that metaphor too. You mentioned, don't put yourself out of the nest if you have no inkling on how to fly. Certainly, there's some prerequisites there. But yeah, that's great advice.
And I do think
So,
that this technique of the worst case scenario is very helpful. I mean, one so because if you think explicitly about that, it's often far less menacing than we believe. A lot of times, the fear that we have in doing stuff is an amorphous kind of fear. It's abstract. It's hazy. But when you actually name it and identify it and specify it, then and it becomes more concrete, and I think therefore less menacing. And my wife and I did the same thing when I decided to leave my job to go out on my own. Again, not a crazy and woolly risk because my wife kept her job and kept her health insurance. But we did make that worst case scenario analysis. And the worst case scenario analysis was this: suppose I went out on my own and totally flopped. I fell out of the nest immediately. I broke my wing. I totally wasn't going to be able to do what I had intended to do. What's the worst case scenario? The worst case scenario is I go back and get a real job. So in that case, the worst case scenario and the status quo were identical. So if you think about that in terms of risk calculation, it's not that risky. So again, I don't want to be cavalier about this, about saying that everybody should take risk. All I'm saying is that if you actually think about risk taking analytically, I think that you will end up having a greater bias for action. You'll have a greater propensity to do stuff, and that it will be rewarded both economically, but more important in terms of your satisfaction.
Yeah, and I mean, as you proved in your latest book, you're more likely to regret not having done it, right? Than you will even with these.
And this is not only business, Shawn. I mean, what I have in this, one of among the stories that I tell in that book and the examples that I have from this is literally thousands upon thousands of regrets from all over the world are people who regret not asking somebody out on a date X years ago. They don't have any great fantasies that had they asked this person out on a date, they would be leading a life of bliss. They were actually disappointed in themselves for not stepping up in that moment and taking their shot. You see it with regard to travel. You see it with regard, I mean, as we've talked about before, with starting businesses. You see it with regard to speaking up when you see something wrong. And so, I mean, again, I'm trying to give people useful decision-making tools. So one of them is think about what the opportunity costs are. Another one is worst case scenario. Another one, which I think is actually a helpful heuristic, is if you're torn, all right, if you're not sure, do it. That basically it's like a tie goes to the runner approach to decision-making. And, if you're sort of 50-50, do it.
I love that. It's that's the opposite, I think, of many people's natural bias, right? Like, well, if I'm not sure, I'm just not going to do anything.
And it's the opposite of some of our professional training too. Depending on so if you're trained as a lawyer, as I am, all you think about is how things are going to go south on you and how to be prudent and not to try stuff. If you're trained as an MBA, you want to do a massive model to show exactly where the risks are and how you can calculate it perfectly. In my view, it's just use these simple heuristics, and one of them is tie goes to the runner.
Yeah, that's one of the greatest things I think I've heard. Right? If when in doubt, do it. That's powerful, Dan. I appreciate that.
I mean, if you're 90-10 the other way, don't do it.
Yeah.
If you're 80-20 the other way, don't do it. Maybe if you're 75-25 the other way, don't do it. But if you're 50-50, do it. Tie goes to the runner.
Man, you're my kind of attorney.
I'd be a terrible lawyer. I never practiced
You're
law
a
a day in my life. I would have been an atrocious lawyer.
I love it. Yeah, no, I agree. The only answer I get from attorneys is no. So
Yeah, I mean, again, what you have is you have. It's a very interesting. It's actually a very interesting point, and it's one reason. I mean, for whatever it's worth, what you have is you have in at least in legal training, you I'm overstating just a bit, but what you have in legal training is the incredible ability to deconstruct, and not so if you have an argument, if you have something that's wobbly, then lawyers are trained to knock it down, and I think that's perfectly appropriate in many cases as part of the profession. My instinct as a person is if I see something wobbly, I want to try to say, hey, what can we do to make it work? What if we do it this way? What if we do it that way? And that runs against a lot of legal. That runs against a lot of legal thinking. And and
yeah,
also in lawyers are always talking about. Lawyers generally give the answer of yes, of no, rather than the answer of yes. And
yeah.
I think that's part of their professional training. And I think in many cases it's sensible counsel. But someone else can do that. I got other shit to do.
Well, look, there's nothing wrong with legal training. I mean, I think it's one of the better paths uh, for general aptitude. You know, if even if you don't want to be an attorney, I mean, it's fantastic training. But I think like
Can I can
your
I can I profoundly disagree with that?
okay, yeah, let's hear
I think that's what I always thought, and I think it's nonsense. I mean,
it.
for all you young people out there, if you want to be a lawyer, go to law school. If you don't want to be a lawyer, don't go to law school.
Do something
Law
else.
school, law school, law school trains you to be a lawyer. And
Uh,
and if you're going to go to law school, young men and women, before you do that, go talk to 10 lawyers. Find out what they do. Spend a day with them. See what their lives are like. Don't infer that you know what law is like because you've watched a few television shows. Find 10 lawyers, spend a day with each of them, find out what their day-to-day work is like, and then decide whether you want to do that. If you do want to do that, go to law school. If you do not want to do that, do not go to law school because once again, there are opportunity costs. There are opportunity costs in the, I graduated massively in debt. I graduated. It actually took me 4 years to graduate from law school because I had
wow.
because I was so miserable. And so there are years of opportunity costs. So I don't believe in law as general training.
All right. So the problem is these shows like Suits, that make it super sexy to be an attorney. And I'm like, man, having even just a little exposure I get to that world, having plenty of attorneys involved in my life in different ways, I can think of two that I know are like passionately happy attorneys who just love to be lawyers. And I feel like and look, this is not meant to discriminate, but I feel like many of the rest fell into it for whatever reason, and then they're kind of stuck doing it,
I'll give you
because
the
they have.
reason they fell into it, Sean, because it goes directly to the theme of this show. They fell
Mm,
into it because they were risk averse.
mm, wow.
It seemed like a safe thing to do, and it is a safe thing to do. And for some people, it's a
Doctor,
great. And it's
lawyer.
for some. Well, no, being a doctor is much. It's much more. It's much more difficult to be a doctor than it is to be a lawyer. It's so freaking easy to be a lawyer. Anybody can be a lawyer.
Mm,
And not everybody can be a doctor.
yeah, I agree.
Being a doctor is really hard. The education it takes longer. The training takes longer. 60% of people who apply to medical school don't get in. Basically, everybody who applies to law school gets in somewhere. So I mean that. I mean, so it's they're very different. They're very different professions. To go into medicine, you have to be really committed. To go into law, you have to be aimless and risk averse.
Yeah, this is great advice. I appreciate it. Really interesting observation. So this is actually leads me to kind of ask you, first of all, let me tell you, based on everything you've said and just, you revealing the way you think about things and the way you thought about things in your life, you're an entrepreneur. I mean, whether you think of yourself that way or not, that's my assessment. It takes one to know one. Obviously our mediums are very different, right? The way
Yeah,
that,
yeah. No, I've been self-employed for over 20 years. I've been self-employed most of my adult life at this point.
yeah,
Like I
yeah.
haven't had. I mean, I'm an employee. I get a W-2 from a business called Daniel Pink Incorporated. But I have not gotten a paycheck from anybody else for 25 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that about, your selling book, To Sell as Human, right? That you get into this idea that we're all selling. We're all salespeople, and it's this ugly word, but it shouldn't be, because almost everyone does it, even the doctors and attorneys and everyone
Sure.
else as well. So I think that's a really powerful idea. So I guess here's a question for you. First, to digress from this idea of you as an entrepreneur, as you see people that are not necessarily, that don't think of themselves as entrepreneurs, or don't think of themselves even as self-employed, or who knows what, where do they get the opportunities to push themselves out of their nest in their professional career? Because people like you and I have a little bit more control over our destiny
Absolutely.
because of the way life unfolded. But have you ever thought about that?
Sure. I mean, I think what you can go for is, if you're in that situation, is to go for small wins. So if you want to push yourself a little bit out of the nest and you have a job, I'm not suggesting that you quit your job tomorrow and go out on your own, but maybe take on an assignment that's a little bit outside of your range. Maybe
Mm.
ask to be part of a different team. Maybe do a rotation in another division. I mean, there are all kinds of ways to give ourselves a little bit more discomfort, and I think that that's really what we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
That doing new things, and again, using your metaphor, pushing yourself out of the nest is uncomfortable, and in many cases, for reasons that are understandable, we recoil from discomfort. We try to avoid it, and in my view, and I think there's very good evidence of this, that leaning into some discomfort is actually really healthy.
Yeah.
And there's some interesting work done by Ayelet Fishbach and Lauren Eskers Winkler, who have found that if you actually reframe discomfort, right? So instead of saying, "Oh wow, this feels uncomfortable," instead of calling it discomfort, say, "This is what learning feels like." And I use that myself. So if I'm feeling uncomfortable doing something new, for instance, I just took earlier this year, I took an acting class, and it was uncomfortable. And when
I
I felt
bet.
uncomfortable, I didn't say, "Oh my God, I'm so uncomfortable." I said, "Oh, this feeling that I'm having right now, this is the feeling I have when I'm learning," and that made it much more palatable.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's wisdom. I think I there are a couple things swirling in my own world right now where I've recognized that there's no way for me to get full knowledge. There's no way for me, because like, let's say the counterparts I'm interacting with, they're just going to tell me what they think I want to hear. They're going to sell me, to your
Yeah,
point, on their services or their abilities. And in the end, I'm just going to have to make the judgment whether, let's say, I go their route, or whether I go out, I do this other thing on my own or whatever. And I think decisions like that face professionals all the time, where we all want to pretend that we can get all the information, or like make decisions fully informed. I think many decisions are impossible to be fully informed, because there's too much unknown out there. We can pretend, we can put together like a nice presentation, but it's impossible to be fully informed about a lot of things. And so in the end, it comes down to making some kind of a bold decision, to because even to do nothing, or to go like the safe route is still a decision, right? There's opportunity cost there, and it's going to send you down one path or another. And so, um, you know, how do you think we make decisions to push ourselves out of the nest, or not, when we don't have enough information, or we can't have enough information? What do
I
you think
think
about
we
that?
give ourselves a reality check of recognizing that we're never going to have full information, that every decision we make under conditions of some amount of uncertainty. So, what you want to try to do is reduce that uncertainty. But if you try to reduce that uncertainty to zero, you're playing a fool's game. What's more,
Yeah.
even if you reduce that uncertainty to zero, there's still luck and randomness out there. And so I think what's most important is that you want to have a good process by which you make decisions, because you have to recognize that if you're making decisions with a degree of uncertainty in a world full of luck, you're going to have outcomes that are not going to be ideal. I mean, on this point, I encourage your listeners to read Andy Duke's book, Thinking in Bets, which is a really great analysis of this sort of thing, and tells you and actually tells you why life is a lot more like, it's like you often hear this, "Oh, it's a chess match. Oh, it's life is a chess." Life is not chess. Life is poker, because poker
Yeah.
has a much greater uncertainty and much more luck.
Yeah. You talk about her in that book, right? To Sell is Human. You got the chance to spend time with her, or or
I didn't.
talk to her?
I've known her. I've known her a little bit over the years. She's a good. I mean, Annie Duke was a PhD graduate student who ended up leaving it to go play poker, and she ended up winning a World Series of Poker championship, which
Yeah,
is
there's that
pretty.
movie about her, right? Isn't that movie about her, or is that a
Is
different?
it?
Is
I
that a
don't
different
know. I
one?
don't know. There's
Okay.
another. I mean, Maria Konnikova has a really delicious book too called "The Biggest Bluff," which is about her leaving her graduating from a PhD program, wanting to learn poker, getting tutored in poker, and then going on to win some riches. But Annie played for a while. But the gist of it is that you have to be able to control what you can control. You can control your decision making process. You can't control your outcome. And so a lot of times, the mistake that we make is that we look at a good outcome and we think that the decision that led up to it was good. Or we look at a bad outcome, we think the decision led up to it was bad. But you can't equate the quality of the decision with the quality of the outcome. All you can focus on is the quality of your decision-making process. And if we do that, we'll be fine, because you're going to make a lot of mistakes. And the thing is, you're going to get bad cards, and other undeserving people are going to get great cards.
Wow. So, as a very analytical person, as a trained attorney, as a business person, is there room for intuition? Is there room, how do you make these when you don't have 100% and you can't have 100% clarity? Where do you turn for that last bit?
I think what you do is I'm not sure, but I'll tell you what I do. First of all, make smaller bets.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a high degree of uncertainty, make small bets. I've changed my view on this, Shawn, over the years. I used to be a big believer in what was known 20 years ago as like big, hairy, audacious goals. When in fact, I actually think that small wins are more powerful. Small wins that pile up to small wins that pile up to small wins. I think those are small. So I think that small experiments and small bets are the way to reduce that. Are a way to reduce that uncertainty. Um,
Incrementalism.
yeah, I just make smaller bets. The other thing is, if you're looking for again a way to make decisions under uncertainty, that's not foolproof at all, but just make decisions that are consistent with your values. So in making this decision, am I being the kind of person I aspire to be? And that can be helpful sometimes too. But again, what we have to the main point of life, and it's also the main point of Andy's book, is that the quality of decisions that we make and the qualities of the outcomes that we experience are not the same. And
Yeah.
so one we have control over, quality of the decisions. One we don't have control over, quality of the outcome. And so, however, if you make quality decisions over time, you're going to be fine, even though each individual outcome is often unpredictable.
Yeah. I think that's where poker really is such a good analogy, because as any really sharp player will tell you, I mean, the outcome of any hand can be calculated down to the
Absolutely.
percent, even without knowing the cards specifically necessarily. But that doesn't mean that, something doesn't show up on the river. That doesn't remove all chance and probability, and man, there's bad beats right and left. And I think, and you talk about that again back. Sorry, I keep going back to the selling book, but I've been reading it recently. And when you talk about buoyancy and the ability
Yeah.
to bounce back, the ability to maintain, any wisdom on the other side of these outcomes that don't always work out. Like we talk about pushing ourselves out of the nest, but you might bounce off the concrete. You may not have the worst outcome, but bad outcomes
Yeah.
happen.
Again, I think what you do is you scrutinize the decision-making process, not the outcome. So, did I make a good decision? Did I think things through fully? And sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. And then you improve your decision-making process, but you don't focus too much on the outcome. You focus on, as I've said repeatedly, you focus on the decision-making process. I think that's the most important thing.
That's great. Very mature. Very, very.
I mean, I think it's difficult because you have to take a step back and approach it analytically. Again, I give you another one of my favorite decision making tools, which is that, if you're stuck on something, ask yourself this question: what would you tell your best friend to do? I find that when people come to me for advice, They say, "Oh, Dan, I don't know. Should I do X, Y, or blah, 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 blah." And I said, "Well, what did you tell your best friend to do?" And they say, "Oh, well, I tell her, blah, blah, blah." You know the answer. So again, this is what's known as Solomon's paradox. King Solomon from the Old Testament, King Solomon was Solomonic in his decision-making capacities, but he made shitty decisions about his own life. And so the Solomon paradox, or Solomon's paradox, whatever it's called, is a principle of social psychology that says that human beings in general are pretty good problem solvers, but we tend to stink at solving our own problems, because we're too close to them. We're too enmeshed in the details. We're too caught up in the minutia. And so that's why we're often better at solving other people's problems, because we have a more fully blown perspective. And so a thing that you can do in solving your own problems is take a step back and asking yourself, what would I tell if my best friend came to me with this scenario? What would I tell them to do? There's other evidence showing that that giving advice is sometimes as helpful, if not more helpful, than getting advice, because again, it puts you in that more distance. So if you're thinking about leaving the nest, imagine your best friend is in the nest and they chirp over to you, "What should I do?" And what would you tell your best friend, the bird in the nest, to do?
Love it. Take a leap and then do it. Like, that's the tricky part, right? It's easy enough to give advice, but to take the good advice, even from yourself, if you're being really honest, I think self-deception is such a cold, hard reality of our existence, right?
Yeah, we are delusional in many ways, and some of those delusions are useful. There's a great book called Useful Delusions by Shankar Vedantam about how being positively deluded about ourselves and the people we love is actually evolutionarily adaptive and can help us get through things. He talks about in the book the delusion that in America, one in two marriages end in divorce, which is shocking to me. But on somebody's wedding, this is his example. On your wedding day, do you think, "Oh man, I'm probably, I got a 50-50 shot of making this work"? No. Everybody on their wedding day thinks they're going to get it to work. And that's probably a good thing.
Be the one. Yeah. Yeah. So on that note, Dan, besides your career as an author, as an entrepreneur, however you view, your professional life, any thoughts on, in your own, any, I don't know, ways that you think you've pushed yourself out of the nest in your personal life in ways unrelated to business? I'm just curious if anything comes to mind in that realm with your kids, your marriage, whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that for parents, I think your nest metaphor is really interesting. I think that it's important to encourage your kids to jump out of the nest. And what you see right now with a lot of parents, particularly upper middle class parents, is that not only they put up a cage over the nest so the kids can't get out, or when the kids jump, they give them a parachute. When the kids jump out of the nest, they give them a parachute, or they go with them. And I think that's really bad. And so and there's some pretty good evidence of that. There's some pretty good evidence as well. John Haidt has written about this recently on how we are essentially overprotecting our kids in physical spaces. That is, not letting them just go outside and play and hang out, and underprotecting them in virtual spaces, in digital spaces, where the consequences are pretty bad. So yeah, I think it's really important when your kids want to leave the nest. I don't mean necessarily leave home, but do stuff and try stuff that you might want to give them a little bit of a nudge. And what's more is that your kids aren't going to listen to you, but they're going to look at what you do. And if they see you edging yourself out of the nest, they might say, "Oh, that old guy can do it. I can do it too."
This is going to be probably play so terribly on a podcast, but it's a real experience. I've even just over the last few years, I've become a big dirt biker, like off-road motorcycling, really tough stuff, steep stuff, rocks, fairly dangerous, but I just have loved it, gotten fairly good at it. And I've gotten my kids into it. And I remember just a few months ago, my daughter, who's 15 now, she's on her little dirt bike, and I'm just teaching them. And I'm literally, she's on the edge of we'll call it a cliff. It's not like a huge cliff, but it's a very steep drop off, and she's nervous to roll off it. The bike will handle it no problem, but she's her first time dropping off something like that.
Yeah.
And I'm pushing my daughter off of a cliff slowly. And then, but I can't help her. Like once that goes, like it's up to her to pull in the clutch, use the rear brake only. If she touches the front brake, she's going to go over the handlebar, and I've told her this, and I'm a big proponent of exactly what you said. Like, and look, I recognize there's some consequence, there's some danger, and she was fine. She did it. And then when she's done, man, she's powerful. She feels powerful. Forget dirt biking. Who cares about motorcycles? It's more of like a life lesson for her. There's nothing she can't do, but she's got to overcome that fear. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think that's an appropriate role of parenting, is to give your kid a little bit of a nudge, because you're more seasoned, you're more experienced, what's a real risk and what's not. So this is true as someone who has taught 3 kids how to ride a bike and 3 kids how to drive a car.
I'm in that stage right now. I was riding passenger seat with her learner's permit yesterday. And that's always exciting.
And my kids will tell you that I was terrible at all of it, but that each one of them now knows how to drive and ride a bike.
That's awesome. Good advice. Yeah, I love that article. Right, I'm Dan Pink, and this is how I parent.
Oh God, yeah. That's.
By the way, what would you change now? Anything?
I wouldn't have done that interview. That's one thing that I would change.
All right, fair enough. So, one last question on what you might change. Speaking of regrets, right? A common theme for you these days. So now that you've been garnering all these regrets, anything just really stand out to you, whether it's goofy, whether it's surprising, you've mentioned a few, but anything else stand out that just really caught you off guard or surprised you with hearing from all these people?
It surprised me how many people have a regret where they have somebody whom they were close to, whether it's a relative or in many, many cases a friend, and the relationship came apart, usually in slow, undramatic ways, not through some kind of fight or some explosiveness, but it just kind of drifted apart. And somebody wants to reach out to someone whom they haven't talked to for 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, and they don't. And the reason they don't is they think it's going to be awkward, and they think the other side is not going to care, and they're always wrong. So it shocks me the number of people who have regrets about that, about letting a friendship or something drift away and then not doing anything to repair it. And we're not talking about like some kind of incredible rift, some kind of big knockdown, drag out fight. We're just talking about the drift of life. And so that's one of the takeaways there is how much people yearn for that kind of human connection, and how much it's important to be intentional about those kinds of things.
Yeah, err on the side of
when in doubt, reach out.
Yeah, I love that. When in doubt, reach out. Right now, we're celebrating Lovesac's 25th anniversary this year, and we happen to have a party where we're inviting people that have been involved throughout 25 years of history, and I'm reaching back out to people that maybe were former employees that I haven't been in touch with for a long time, even some former friends, even people that may have left on their own volition or even the company's volition on not the best terms.
Mm-hmm.
And it's amazing how time is a healer and how important it is to reach out, and how I think that's a very powerful piece of advice. I appreciate you sharing that. What about let me save you 25 years. If you could reach back out to yourself, I don't know, in your 20s, pick an earlier time in your life. What's one piece of advice you'd give yourself to maybe save yourself a chunk of time, get ahead? I don't know, save yourself some grief. Any great wisdom from Dan Pink?
I think it would be a few things. Number one, I would go back to this idea of having a bias for action. That a lot of times we try to figure stuff out and then act. And what I've discovered over the years is that acting is a form of figuring stuff out. That it's kind of indulgent to sit around and think and stroke your chin and say, let me plan this, let me think this through. That in some ways planning is overrated and doing is underrated. And that even more to the point, that, as I said before, acting is a form of figuring out. That sometimes we have the sequence wrong. We think we have to figure things out and then take action, when in fact, action to me is a form of figuring things out. I've learned more by acting than I have by contemplating.
I love that
and
bumper
and that
sticker.
would have surprised me that would have surprised me in my 20s, when I thought that what you're supposed to do is figure stuff out, plan, and then execute on that.
Yeah, that's powerful. I love that bumper sticker, F around and find out.
Yeah,
And in fact, my first in my 20s, my first business book was, if I were to write one then, would have been called, I used to use this phrase, business backwards, because it was in a time we were bootstrapping before the word bootstrapping was invented. Today, like all this entrepreneur stuff on social media, there's like advice everywhere. There's all these
yeah.
phrases. Back then we were a bunch of college kids selling these beanbags on the lawn. We had no business plan. It was fashionable to have a business plan and whatever. And we were just doing it. And as much as, we did a lot of things wrong, I don't regret that. You talk about regrets. I don't regret just doing that stuff. There are probably some specific things I regret, but overall I'm very grateful that we just did it. And that's been a useful mantra for sure. I appreciate you sharing. So anything you want to plug, Dan? I mean, I'm really excited to see what you do next. I mean, I've been a fan of everything you've written, and I think you're a very wise soul.
Hey, thanks.
What's coming next? Anything you want to plug? Obviously, I've plugged all your books for you, but anything coming up?
Buy the book, see the movie, download the audio. No, I got nothing to plug except for go to, if you want to subscribe to my newsletter, if you want, at danpink.com. Check out the books at danpink.com. I'm here taking a little bit of a break, trying to figure out what to do, doing some small experiments to try to figure out what's next.
I'm excited. Well, anything I can do to be useful to you, happy to be. Really grateful for your time sharing with us. So much wisdom can be found in all of Dan's books. You can follow Dan, as I do, on Twitter or Instagram at Daniel Pink. He has TED Talks on YouTube and is biggest on LinkedIn, where he will continue to inspire you to think differently about so many things. It's always good if it came from Dan. Honestly, we are so grateful to get your insights today on pushing oneself out of the nest, booking the gig, taking the leap, whatever you want to call it. You can save yourself a chunk of 25 years, perhaps, if you do it. Don't forget to like this podcast or video. Please subscribe. Help us build this, and do share it on social media to your friends. Help them save a chunk off their 25-year march, because you're just that kind of friend. Thank you to the authority amongst authors, the father of fathers, the dolphin of drive, the savior of selling, the redeemer of regret, and those in their right minds, like me, Mr. Daniel Pink. This was amazing. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Shawn.
And to everyone listening, push yourself out of the nest. Grateful to be with you.